welcome to another episode of Fresh Off the Boat. And I'm
Uh,
super delighted to be with Ketan. Ketan is a student I've known since 2014 15, and then he went to Duke University for the 4 year undergrad program and then pursued many more things which we'll learn about studying at LSC and then finally doing a law degree at the New York University Law School. So over to you, Ketan, and I have this first question I would want you to begin with is, can you describe the journey from, say, India as an international wide-eyed student going to
yeah,
Duke? And then what are the biggest challenges and rewards that you felt you, being an international student, sort of experienced and achieved?
yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things was, firstly, it's great to catch up with you, Arjun, after so long. And when I reflect back on it, I think the biggest thing as an international student was just sort of understanding how big the world is. I think that was a pretty big thing for me. Delhi was, I was from Delhi. I went to high school in Delhi, and it seemed sort of like a small world generally. I think, like definitely diverse in like an Indian context. But I think when I went to Duke and I started as a freshman, understanding how big the world is, like the different places that my friends, most of whom were international students, sort of like the different countries that they come from. That was, I think, just a general sort of perceptive shock. I think, just in terms of seeing that, hearing that, and talking about it, like it was something that sort of moved me and affected me. I think another like sort of big shock was academic, slightly, in terms of, I did humanities and math, but in the CBSE system, which it doesn't, I think, place that much of an emphasis on necessarily like independent thinking, essay writing, critical reading, things like that. So a lot of the skills that you see on the SAT in terms of critical reading and writing like in a good way, those aren't things that were emphasized in high school. And then of course that's those same skills and then like deployed at like a higher level at the undergraduate level, at university. So I had trouble initially because I was majoring in political science and public policy, and I had to write all these essays, essays and read sort of the classics, read like these texts written by the Romans and the Greeks, and all the stuff about like liberty and democracy, and like and they would always ask like, what is your opinion on this, or how would you argue, XYZ? And I'd never been trained to do that. So learning how to do that was, I think, quite a leap, and that process itself made me grow a lot. And I think the essay writing process for colleges actually in the US, which we did, with Arjun, with everyone else, of course, like that was also actually a nice little intro to that world, in the sense of like, oh, they really want to know about you, they want to know about your opinion and like your beliefs and what drives you. So those were, I think, the two big sort of transitions or challenges that marked my evolution as like an international student. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think, just to sum it, your perspective as a student going from India completely changed when you sort of were in a world full of people from different parts of, like, not just
Yeah.
globe, but also people with different perspectives and culture and all of that. That's pretty defining for an international student. Very often we don't consider that to be the most important reason you go to study abroad, but eventually when you reflect back, like Ketan just did, is just fantastic. And the second aspect was the pedagogy, the studying, the the methods employed in class, and the critical thinking aspect of it. So thanks again for bringing that point home so early on in our conversation. So students can prepare for such thinking. Of course, there are international curriculums that do have some of these things, but very often, even schools, as kids I meet from Ivy schools in India, they think it's not the real Ivy. They just get the very much how to crack the IB program instead of developing some of these skills.
That's a cultural, I think, tendency, right? Which is not, it's not to say, by the way, that it's a good or a bad thing. Like there's no normative thing aspect to it. It's just like it is what it is, right? Like, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
I think the liberal arts tradition is not something that's intuitive maybe to us, but it is different, and I think it offers like a world of possibilities. So it's a challenge
for sure. Yeah, but definitely growing for sure in India in terms of
exactly, with Ashoka, with other schools.
Awesome. So life at Duke is something very often students keep asking, okay, what is life at Duke like? Why is it so different from XYZ overlapping colleges?
Yeah.
What, essentially, when you talk about life, you can break it down into academic life also. And that's so
Mhm.
subjective to each student. Some students find professors, mentors, and departments they never thought they'll be ending up doing their major
Mhm.
in. So, in your case, your journey to choose political science and public policy, was it kind of pre-mediated or kind of determined, or how did it evolve?
So that's an interesting question because I think I can, I would sort of slice the question in half for me because political science was premeditated for sure. I knew that I wanted to do it from class 10. In fact, a big part of the reason why I even looked to apply abroad was because I wanted to study political science. And I knew that it was a social science and it was linked to the humanities. That's not something that in my impression, and this is also, to be fair, like speaking of like the 2014, 2013 era, I think now there's much more, as you mentioned, much more of an emphasis on liberal arts education. There are many more opportunities. But I think back then I just felt like, this was the place to be, in the US or the UK, maybe the US more, because, it's very interdisciplinary. Like they teach every subject in a very interdisciplinary way. If they teach you politics, they'll teach you how it's connected to economics and history and literature and all these other things. And the other thing was research opportunities and like emphasis on that. And being able to sort of like just throw resources at a proposal or a goal that you had to pursue. And if you had a good enough proposal and a good enough reason to get after it, like they would help you do that, which was a new sort of paradigm for me. I never thought that that was a possibility. So the political science thing was set in stone. Public policy is fairly similar, but still different at Duke. I think it's a pretty unique major because we don't have a major in international relations, like a lot of other universities do. We don't have a major in developmental studies and things like that. So public policy is itself very interdisciplinary, and you can concentrate within that in international relations, national security, public health, things like that are within, that fall within public policy. I think public health might actually be a separate major now, but it's a sort of a much more general, but still a very application based major. So there's some political science pieces to it, but there's a lot of game theory, statistics, strategy analysis, things like that. Some economics to it. So it's very focused on application and problem solving, but as relating to public policy. So that was a sort of decision I came to when I was already I'd been at Duke for I think 1.5 years or 2 years at that point, and I saw friends taking these classes that were popular, that were interesting. I liked the electives that they offered, so I thought that it was a nice complement to political science. Like complementary but not the same. So that was the thinking behind that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about application of knowledge,
Mhm.
and can you share some sort of memorable experiences, say at the council, when you were a council member at the Duke program in American Grant Strategy? Was that
Yeah,
part of the whole public policy program?
for sure. So, I mean, it was based out of that's a fair question actually, because it was based out of the public policy school. So that was based out of the public policy school. It focused on foreign policy, but from an American perspective, which was interesting for me because I was interested in foreign policy, but I was never I wasn't a big fan initially of the idea that it was rooted in like the American establishment perspective on things, but I felt like it was important to understand. If you're like a student of foreign policy, you just want to still understand the American establishment and how it works and how foreign policy works, both like in an international arena, but like within America, how the role it plays in elections and other like political institutions like Congress. So we always, and it was affiliated with the public policy program. So it didn't fulfill any requirements for me per se, but a lot of the same like professors who were teaching public policy classes were involved with the program. And that was amazing because I got to travel to a bunch of different places where conflicts had taken place, and conflict analysis was the main idea. So we went to Vietnam to study the Tet Offensive, which was a very specific part of a specific phase of the Vietnam War. We went so this was as a freshman, so I'd been at Duke for 4 months at this point. So this was during winter break. It was amazing. And the idea was that you went to the places where those battles took place, and we all had to play the role of some sort of policymaker, normal soldier, or high up military executive, or other sort of stakeholder in the conflict, and like think from that perspective of like why they did what they did and like what you can learn from that, both in terms of history in the military, but also in terms of strategy, right? And those takeaways you can apply to every area of life, whatever you do end up doing after. So that was amazing. And then we did the 100 Days War in World War One in Belgium and France. That was my sophomore year, spring break. An odd way to spend spring break, I think. It was rainy in Belgium and France, but it was amazing. I mean, I think it was fantastic. And these are exactly the sort of experiences that I'd sort of been sold on, before applying to the US. And I couldn't, I mean, and I was what, like, I think 19, 20 at the time, and I could barely believe that like this was happening. Like I was able to do this with so much support from the school, and really sort of apply classroom things to like the situation that's as real world as it gets. So
Yeah, so this is, I think, another very valid point for all
Mhm.
students. Like, the schools are not just offering you those kind of classes, which like a job, which is 9 to 5, and you sort
Mhm.
of wind up and just hang out with friends. Of course, that's important too. But the kind of resources you get even in your freshman year uh, is just fantastic to hear. Things like the council membership at this Duke
For
program,
sure.
and
Yeah.
many other things that you eventually ended up doing. So also there's something on your resume which says the BAS connection, if I pronounced it correctly, and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. I mean, of course, there's the JPAL. A lot of people
Mhm.
know about that. But uh, again, these are very unique opportunities. So just
Mhm.
describe a little bit about what these two were, and why should students look at them.
Yeah, for sure. So BAS Connections, I think, is a program that Duke talks a lot about in its admissions materials, and when they like talk when they meet students at these at the events that they host. But I think it was hard for me to understand what it was till the time that I got to Duke. But when I did, it's actually really fantastic. So what you do again, this is also affiliated with I mean partly with the public policy school, but I think it's just again interdepartmental. So there are many different departments at Duke that are involved in it. It's the BAS Connections program it's an interdisciplinary program funded by the BAS family, hence the name. And there are a bunch of different themes that you can choose from, or teams, I guess, linked to a theme that you can choose amongst. And these are basically teams composed of undergraduate students of all levels. So you have freshmen, seniors, sophomores, etc. And then you also have grad students, PhD candidates, and then of course it's led by a faculty member, so a professor. And the one that I did was it was focused on the idea of youth voting, and why the youth don't like why young voters don't vote in as large numbers as like other age groups, and what we can do to solve that problem. Statistically, what is the underlying problem. And so we would go through. My job was to essentially, and it had a lot of economics to it, statistics to it, and political science to it, as well as just real world problem solving. So one of my big jobs was that they had a lot of interviews from people across North Carolina, across age groups and races, etc. And I would code them. So I would basically input little details about those interviews when in terms of how the person was responding to a certain question, affirmative, negative, etc. And then that data was then used to like draw inferences using statistical analysis. That oh, like maybe it's it's an ideological factor that's driving young people to vote less, or maybe it's a convenience or access factor, or something like that. So it was a pretty amazing program. I did that, I think, for all of my junior year, and I got to know the professor really well. I met other people through that. It was pretty amazing. And this is just one example, but of course there were other BAS Connections teams focused on things that were more STEM focused, things that were more humanities focused. It ran the gamut. Yeah, so it was a wide variety of teams.
Yeah, and also about the other program, this
JPAL.
JPAL. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, JPAL. So JPAL was more of just an internship that I did while. So this was between my junior and senior year at Duke, and this was at the point where I was sort of very focused on policy application. So I wasn't so focused on theoretical political science. I was more focused on policy making and policy application, and how like all of this classroom theory affects actual policy that governments apply in over, and they impose on large populations in the world, such as ours and India. And so I'd known about them because I know that one of the founders, Abhijit Banerjee, I think wrote this really famous book called Poor Economics, which I think everyone should read. And it talks about how if governments create welfare policy focused policies that are informed by empirical results, that are informed by tests, and that are backed by statistical evidence, those things have a much greater impact. And so that's the sort of work that I did at JPAL. So JPAL runs a lot of programs in partnership with different state governments in India, with the union government in India, different states. They sometimes even collaborate with other nonprofit organizations. And I would basically, a lot of times we were trying to convince, IS officers, bureaucrats or ministers that, hey, look, we have statistical evidence on this policy that you're trying to do or that you're thinking of but haven't implemented. We think you should do X, Y, Z. And so I would try and translate a lot of the theoretical statistical stuff into PowerPoint presentations that are digestible for someone who's not, theoretically versed in it, but they are the ones in charge of, deciding on policy matters. So it was amazing. I mean, I think, again, a great practice in sort of bringing together theory and application.
Thanks. That's a good wrap about your academic life at Duke. But there's always that student life which goes beyond
Of course,
studying aspect and career sort of focus activities which sort of propel you to think about the future as a professional. What is it really like to be at Duke as a human being and trying to sort of fit in as well as sort of thrive eventually? What is the setting like? How does it promote certain activities which bring the community together? What do you think is the mood on campus generally by the admin and the students that really makes it different? So you could go on to many layers like the setting,
of course.
Some of the things that you did, or some of the things your friends did, but that's something that you probably didn't, but you found them to be pretty unique.
No, for sure. So I think the social life piece is, with Duke, it's always interesting, I think, because it's always, I think there are lots of ideas, I think, floating around about that, also partly because, how Duke has been in the media and also because it's sort of, I will say it's a bit odd compared to peer schools in a good way, I found, because most of its peer schools in terms of, selectivity or academics, et cetera, are in the Northeast. And in terms of, if you look at it like in that sort of, from that lens, it's a bit strange because it's in the South. And so culturally, it's a bit different. But still, demographically, I found that the vast majority of students were, some were from the South, but a lot were from the Northeast, California, all over the US, and a pretty, I think, sizable chunk of and proportion of international students every year. So it's a very interesting mix because you take a school of that sort of academic caliber, which feeds from like the best schools in the country, but the best high schools in the country and internationally. But then also it's, geographically in the South. And then it also has a big sports culture. So that's, I think, one thing that, it's known for, and it sort of paints a certain image. I think it's also true that Greek life was a big factor. It was quite dominant, I think, I would say, while I was at Duke. And I think there are different people have different takes on that sort of thing. For me, I would say that, if you coming from Delhi, I'd never lived in the US before, obviously. So a lack of information can sometimes like lead to misconceptions about this sort of thing. And what I really enjoyed about my time at Duke was that, Greek life was big, but then they also had a lot of other selective living groups, which were non-Greek, that were also social groups and were co-ed. And even in terms of, universities that have sort of a big Greek life label in terms of Penn and Dartmouth, et cetera, that are comparable. I always loved the fact that, it helped create like a cohesive social community, but I was never in Greek life, frankly. Like I never joined, that was never part of it, but I had friends who were, and it just provides one more aspect to your social life, to how you want to organize it. So it's one more option on the menu versus something that you have to do, or if you don't do it, then, you'll have no one and you'll suffer socially or anything like that. So I think as an international student, it's sometimes challenging to understand really what the landscape is and what your choices are. I don't think that there's much of a reason to really be nervous about that. So I really liked it. I also liked the fact that our campus was really good and really big. We had a lot of resources and facilities, and I think people liked living on campus, even when they had the option the last year to move off campus, right? Or they would spend most of the time on campus just because, in terms of the sports culture, tenting in Cable, all of that, along with just how the student body is, I think, oriented. Like people like being around their friends, even after class, before class, during class, you see people It wasn't uncommon to meet new groups of people, or like strike up conversations with people you haven't met before, even though you've been there for 3 years and you've just run into someone. I found that folks were pretty friendly overall. And I think also a big factor was the large group of international students who were there every year, right? Like I think Duke places an emphasis on it. And I like the fact that I had this large group of people who were all also from different countries and different settings and were adjusting to the US. And I felt like having that group, finding my friends within that group gave me a lot of confidence as a freshman, because like I didn't know how to navigate it, but none of us did. But we were all, happy to be there, happy to get to know each other and to figure it out together. So that was pretty awesome, I think. And one last disclaimer that I would say is that I think my experience at Duke was also a little different because this was 2016 to 2020. I think the housing, they had housing reform recently. So if there were any concerns about Greek life, etc., that's an even smaller part of social life from what I hear now. And they've basically created a housing model with residential colleges, which sort of encourages people of across social life groups and across different spectra of like student life to live together in residential colleges, sort of similar to the model that they have working at Yale for many decades. And I think that that's going to even create even more intermixing and like create even more like diverse experiences. So I think overall it was really good. I had a great time. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that was the first part of our conversation. And I think moving to part two, which is essentially grad school life and then
Right.
discovering your pre-professional sort of career path, which is studying law and then practicing law. Now, there was always this thing, right? Like students in the US mostly stick to the US for grad school, and they found their bearings, they've understood the system. But you chose a very different path, and studying international relations from public policy, which you mentioned was not offered, but pretty much was a similar sort of experience. What prompted you to choose the London School of Economics, and how do you think is the experience of academic life different from, say, typical colleges in the US when you look back and think of your years at LSE?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would note with LSE would be that I think a lot of this whole experience was also shaped by COVID. And because I graduated in 2020 and COVID happened in like about March 2020. So in terms of my options and things like that, a lot of it was very specific calculus that I had to adopt during that time. But I mean, I had been interested in, so I sort of always thought of law school as, a maybe likely goal. That's something I would do. But I always wanted to either work before going to law school and or get a grad school degree to allow me to just, read books and sort of enjoy the subject areas that I had without the pressure of pre-professional life, as you mentioned. So I had applied during my senior year to Oxford and LSE, both for international relations degrees. One part of the whole UK thing was that I felt like, and I sort of, from what I understood, international relations and politics is taught in a very different way in the UK than the US. I feel like it's much more international. There's a much bigger emphasis on other areas of politics and humanities, such as like post-colonial studies, and it's from post-colonial lens. I think, for example, if you study international relations in the US, it's much more focused on the US and strategy and like a little more of an emphasis on military relations and things like that, which I felt like I'd already tasted. So I wanted to try something new. And I also had always, before committing to the US to study, I had entertained the idea of studying abroad in the UK, and I didn't end up doing that. And I'm glad I went to the US and went to Duke, but I felt like this was like a nice opportunity to sort of sample that, see what's on offer there and what they have, what sort of style they adopt to teaching. And so I applied to the international relations programs at Oxford, which was 2 years, and then LSE, which was 1 year. I was happy to be accepted to both. However, at that point, I was also pretty sure that I was going to go to law school after, since I didn't want to spend the better part of like my, the first half of my life studying. I felt that it was prudent to take the 1 year a master's in international relations at LSE versus the 2 year degree at Oxford, since I was going to go to law school anyway after. And one thing that you realize, so if you're at a US university looking to go to law school in the US, interestingly enough, at the top schools, I think top 6 specifically, and maybe top 14, if you go on LinkedIn or if you ask around, you'll see that it's a very, very common thing to go to get a grad school degree at Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or UCL. And it's a very common thing to get a master's in science or MPhil or MA. And I think it's just a credential. This is not something that I knew at the time, but like there's something I realize now. It's sort of, I got lucky on that because it's a credential that the better law schools in the US just like. Partly because I think it shows like, I guess a willingness to try out new places, as well as a willingness to, do deep academic study of something before going to professional school. And so it worked out very well. I enjoyed it. I will caveat saying that most of my LSE experience was remote because of COVID. COVID was bad in London as well as in Delhi, so I couldn't quite, I didn't know if and when to fly to London and like get accommodation for a 1-year degree. So it was mostly from Delhi. I will say I liked my professors a lot. They were very accessible. I had office hours. I had as like awesome of an experience as you can remotely, frankly. It was amazing. And the books were great. The reading lists were fantastic. The seminars were really good. I did get what I wanted. I think it was a very different way of teaching these things from the US. And not to say that like one is better than the other, but I think I'm better for having experienced the British way of teaching post-colonial, teaching from a post-colonial lens, like international relations and foreign policy and things like that. Yeah, I really like my professors. I even got to know some of the students. So, we sort of chatted and got to know each other. Some of them have crossed paths with in real life, some maybe in the future. But that was fantastic. And I think overall, I think if I think about it more pragmatically, it really helped me set up for law school in terms of my application, in terms of, also just like getting all that writing and reading in helps. Law school is mostly reading and writing. So since I decided towards the end of my career at Duke that I would go to law school, it worked as a very good natural step, like a natural next step, grad school at LSE.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's what I'm going to get to now. Applying to law school. Often, students who've done that, they do sort of recollect that undergrad applications somehow could be similar and a bit different, of course, for law school. You're much more mature, you're much more focused on a career path and all of that. And you have more experiences related to a specific thing. By being a high schooler, you're pretty much, you're open to everything. And very few kids are experienced in, what they want to do for the rest of their lives. So how was the law school application different? And what do you think you learned in the process? JD in the US is challenging, is very selective. So let's hear from you and learn.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think like a lot of other Indian students, I think in my position, I was sort of facing a bit of a dilemma or a trilemma maybe, because I think a lot of Indian students in my position sort of run into is that, okay, I went to undergrad in the US. I liked it. I liked the way that they taught it. And then the more I heard about law school in the US, because quite frankly, I'd never thought about law school in the US before going to Duke. And even while at Duke, I mean, halfway through my career, I started like learning about it, thinking about it. Because I'd always just assumed that, if I want to do law, like, why wouldn't I just study, law in India and then go abroad for an LLM, or why wouldn't I just study law in the UK, which is also, it's a legal system that's closer to India's, it's more analogous. I mean, the US and UK are both common law countries, but the UK is much more similar to India than it is to the US. And so I thought about that a lot. I learned, what I learned was that again, like, as is, I think, in my opinion, true for undergrad, it is also true with law schools. I think law schools in the US, the best ones especially, their resources are unparalleled. I think the way that they teach law, their faculty are also, I would argue, I think, unparalleled to quite an extent. And I think the last thing that I learned was also that the value of the JD is quite different, just because US capital markets and US equity markets are so important. The US has a certain role culturally, but more importantly, like economically in the world. And, that there's a demand for US qualified lawyers anywhere from London to Singapore. And that's not, always true. Or I mean, it's not like a US lawyer from any law school would be desired anywhere in the world. But if you go to one of the better law schools in the US, you get a pretty great education. And I felt like my liberal arts education in the US was had a good sort of synergy with that. I felt like there was a good link there. I felt like there was a good complementary sort of relationship, uh, which is why I first decided on a JD. Then the next part of the puzzle was trying to figure out, okay, well, I don't know any other Indians who've gotten a JD, and who can I find? And I found a friend who was, at the time, he just started his JD at Columbia Law School. He'd been to undergrad at Berkeley. He was also from Delhi, and we found each other through mutual friends. And I chatted with him, and I reached out to a bunch of other, actually just people that I knew through people or saw them online, and I reached out to them and chatted with them about their degree at these schools. And one thing I realized pretty quickly is that, especially if you're an international student, you do want to go to the best law school you can go to. There are many law schools in the US, and the JD in general has a lot of value. But I think that if you're someone with like, if you want to practice at a very high level, whether it's at a corporate firm, or you want to do public interest work, or like international law work, if you want the most opportunities, and also if you're just an international student with some sort of visa uncertainty, some degree of visa uncertainty in the future, which I did have at the time in the US, you want to go to the best law schools possible. And once you get to that, the delineation is pretty clear. It's like the top 14, which is 14 is an odd number to draw a short list out at, but that's how it is. It's been historically the same. I think there's some change at the bottom, near the bottom. And then within the top 14, depending on who you ask, you have the top T6 or top 6, which historically have been Yale, Harvard, Chicago, and then Columbia, NYU, and Stanford, of course. Stanford, I think, near Yale up there. So you generally have those. And obviously, depending on, some outcomes of changing of rankings, like, some schools will go up and down, but by and large, that's how employers or law schools will see that rank. And so I realized pretty quickly that it would only really be worth my time to go to a good law school in the US. Otherwise, I think I could just, I could go to law school in the UK. It would be shorter, frankly, cheaper, quicker, and I would have more complementarity with India anyway. But once I realized that, I also realized that the way that the law school application process differs from undergrad is that I think the undergrad process is much more holistic. I think the law school process is holistic. They do have essays, but it's holistic in a narrower sense because they expect much more of you because you've been to undergrad. Many people I'm at school with, have worked for many years. They've been investment bankers, consultants, startup founders or workers. They've done all sorts of interesting things. Some of them got PhDs before coming to law school. So they expect much more of you at that stage than, I'm intellectually curious and I'm stepping out into the world. They hope that you've figured out what your general interests are and maybe hopefully what your specific interests are in the law. And like, they want a very strong statement of what's motivating you to come to law school, essentially. And so your resume and the experiences you've had, along with those essays, that essay part of why law school A and then why this law school. So that's where your holistic component gets in. But as you're seeing, it's much more focused in its holistic nature. It's not a general sense of like, oh, what would you like to be in the world? It's much more focused. And, why would you like to be a lawyer? So that sort of thing. Why law school? Why would you like to be a lawyer? And why this law school? And then I think the other part that's sort of much more rigid, I think maybe even than the SAT, because like I know a variety of, SAT scores can vary a lot. And undergrad schools are, I think, of course, it's getting more and more selective every year, but there's still some leeway, right? If your essays are outstanding, if your life experiences are exceptional and unique. But here, yes, if your life experiences are unique and exceptional, that's awesome. But like, you will need to get a good LSAT or GRE score. So I know a lot of law schools now, even the best ones, take the GRE as well. Most people take the LSAT. The general sense amongst my peers and friends at that point was that if you get a high LSAT score, that's a bit more valuable than a high GRE score because an LSAT is quite difficult. But I realized pretty quickly that I had to do well on the LSAT. So, to that effect, I took it twice. I took it once. I was not super satisfied with my score. I took it the second time. Thankfully, broke into the range that helped me do what I wanted to do. It's graded out of 180. And if you want a good shot at the best law schools, I would I think most people would agree that you want to get at or above a 172 generally is what you would like to get. So 95th percentile at the best law schools again. And there's some flexibility with that. So obviously, for example, if you had elite work experience in some sense, right? Like you've went to you worked at a highly desired consulting firm, or you did something super, super special. Maybe, you're a representative for your country at the UN. Then, of course, you can have more flexibility on those other components. But I realized that LSAT number was it was a big variable. And also a lot of people have the mentality of like, well, a 1 point increase on the LSAT could change my outcomes completely. So like, why would I not invest my time and resources in taking it, the number of times I need to get the score I need? So that was the approach that I had. I think it was a much more focused, narrower, maybe rigid, but not necessarily rigid in a bad way process. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think this almost wraps up our session, and I'm sure I'll be bothering you again to sort of do another session on your overall law school experience, and for our students who are now completing college or workforce and are considering that. So just to understand this global mobility part, like you mentioned, the JD in the US allows you to do many things across the globe. But being in court in another country, how does that work? How does that mobility, like in India, there's this bar council membership,
Right.
or the countries might have that. So what's the process students should keep in mind before sort of jumping in and looking at studying law abroad?
Yeah, that's a bit tougher. I think that's something that I learned while I was at law school pretty much. I think the idea is, the general sense would be that the court piece, like litigation, that part of the practice. So if you're a lawyer, you can be a lawyer of sort of primarily two types, I would say, across like large corporate, elite corporate firms would be either litigation or transactional work. Transactional work is more focused on capital markets, mergers and acquisitions, banking, finance, things like that. So you're not going to court, you're not arguing. You're basically putting together contracts, reviewing them, negotiating. It can be very exciting in its own way, but it's different. I think what most of us have in mind when you think about law school and being a lawyer is litigation, in terms of you're drafting arguments, you're going to court, you're doing the thing. And so I would say global mobility is much greater for transactional lawyers. I would say. That is not to say that if you're a litigator, that doesn't mean that you can't go work abroad if you're barred in America. It's just that, for example, if I want to work in England tomorrow because of a visa thing, or I prefer England, or it's closer home, or if I want to work in India, I will have to get barred there at some point, or I'll have to get some sort of qualification in order to be able to appear in the court of that country. There are more restrictions. And the other issue with that practice group is they would want you to sort of know more about that country's jurisprudence and law. So of course, we've all studied like corporations law or criminal law, whatever that is. We've studied it generally, conceptually, and there are some concepts that are similar. But in Indian corporations law will be a little different from British corporations law, which will be a little different from American corporations law. So they would want you to know more of the jurisprudence and legal codes of that country, which becomes a bit of a barrier sometimes. So it's a bit easier to transfer from place to place when you're doing transactional work, which is not that different, especially if you're working for US clients. US clients are everywhere. There are also companies everywhere that want to interact with US capital markets. So, that intersection, or that US angle, will pretty much be anywhere for if you're a transactional lawyer. It'll be there in Hong Kong, it'll be there in Singapore, it'll be there in London. And so it's much easier to get around. Things don't change much. You don't necessarily need to get barred again. Yeah.
So we'll wrap with like 5 questions, rapid fire questions around with you. It's so much fun to catch up with you. Just thought of a few of these. So what was your, say, most memorable class or even professor relation at Duke?
At Duke, I think I had this one professor who I studied a lot of. It's funny to say this, but I studied a lot of corruption with. I mean, she was a political economy professor, and she taught this class the first class was on global corruption. and the second class was on law, order, and rights in China, but also about corruption and political economy and things like that. So it was the intersection of politics and economics, and I loved that. And I mean, she was a fantastic mentor. I think it was more. I realized I really liked being in her class when I realized I could just like go to her office hours and ask her questions about life and what to do after and who am I and all these things. And I mean, she was amazing. She was a great conversationalist, even more so than just like a professor whose class I was in. And yeah, turned out to be a great mentor, helped me with thinking through law school, grad school, all of that stuff.
My next question is, what is that one word that would describe your JD experience at NYU and why?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think it's a grind. Honestly, that's the one word I would say. Yeah, because I will, I think it's been amazing. I think there's a word and there's a phrase. The grind would be in terms of how difficult it is and how sort of nonstop like the work is, but I think it's also an intellectual feast because if you're someone who could never decide between subjects, you get to study politics, literature, history, philosophy, economics, all of that at the highest level through the law. So I thought that, that was also amazing. So I think I sort of cheated on that question, but it would be the word and the phrase. Yeah.
Awesome. Who is that one legal figure that you admire and why?
I think it would be B.R. Ambedkar. Yeah, I always think a lot about him because I think he went to Columbia Law himself actually when he was a young man and studying abroad. He went to LSE also actually, so I don't know, maybe we have something in common there. I think he's such a big figure when I was studying political science in India, and he's so inspiring. And I wish he was more inspiring to even more of my peers in India. More people knew about what he did to get an education that get the education that allowed him to sort of impact all of our lives today in terms of helping write most of the constitution. So he's a big figure of inspiration.
What is your favorite book or author, or who is your favorite author?
I think my favorite author remains the same actually that as from class 12. It was George Orwell. Yeah, so it's the same. George Orwell's favorite book would still be Burmese Days by him. Yeah, and this hasn't changed in 7 years, which is pretty wild.
And last, but yeah, probably kind of something which is common, but you have a perspective because you've lived in the UK and the US. Tea or coffee?
Coffee, easily. Yeah,
Awesome.
not even a contest. Yeah.
So it's early morning here, so probably I'll need one.
Yeah.
Take care, and look forward to being in touch again.
Of course. Thank you.
And thank you so much for sharing so many insights. And I'm sure this one we'll have to break it down and make
of course.
these
Yeah.
things which will be useful.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Of course. Pleasure, Arjun. Thank you.